Hello, everyone. My name is Jason Yoong. I'm the COO of Level Up, and co-moderating with me is Alex Hart, an engineering leader and Level Up community member. Today, the two of us are speaking with Annie Duke about making better decisions, a big topic, and also one that Annie knows very well, being a former professional poker player and very successful one at that, I'll add, and best-selling author. I think many of you have read Thinking in Bets, and frankly, one of the go-to decision-making experts. If you ask anyone about this topic, how do I become a better decision maker, et cetera, you will often hear Annie's name. So Annie, good to see you and welcome.
Thank you for having me. That was a very nice introduction. I'm blushing.
I like to keep it short and sweet. Okay, let's dive right into it because we have a lot to cover. Okay, first topic, because this is a popular one, uh, empowering your team with decision making is the overarching. So many of our members are senior leaders with big businesses, big teams. We're talking 50 plus people, managing hundreds, maybe billions of dollars. Um, what is a top action these leaders can take to help their team make better quality decisions without them being in the room? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think the main thing is to create structure around the decision making. So I think part of the problem that we have as decision makers is, I think that people think that, oh, we have this very big issue because we're riddled with cognitive biases and we take all these shortcuts in our decision making. And there's a whole bunch of writing that's in that space, like Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, obviously being the most famous. Um, of the works in that space, which is just pointing out the flaws in human judgment, like what are the ways that we go wrong. Um, and I think that the big mistake that people make is that they think, well, if I just educate myself and I educate the people on my team about these types of biases, like overconfidence, um, for example, uh, confirmation bias, um, that we're good, right? Like if we know about it, we're good. And so if I just teach people that, then everything's going to be fine. And the fact that it's not true, there's just a lot of data that shows that that's not true. There's a great kind of working paper that I'm going to put in the chat by Ariella Crystal and Laurie Santos that shows that. I'm going to put it over in the chat. Um, so what I'm really interested in, what I focus on in my work, and I really believe in is you need to know about the biases so that you know what you're combating, right? In order to think about how to help empower people to make better decisions. But that the solution to that is not knowledge, but more so structure. And then if you can create a lot of structure and guardrails around people's decision making, you're going to do better. So that's the first thing. We can dig into that separately if you want. And then I think the second thing is to really have very good mental models around what are the decisions that actually deserve a lot of time, attention, effort, very robust structure around them, and which ones don't. Because the ones that don't require as much of that, uh, you can actually just empower people to make those decisions themselves pretty quickly, obviously with some requirement to inform. Um, but for you to understand how do you give your team the mental models that tell them when are they supposed to kick something up to you or up to the next level? And I think that that's very hard for people. And what you end up happening is really slowing an organization down because they're kicking kind of everything up. They're trying to get approval on everything. Or if they're not doing that, they're spending a lot, like way too much time and effort on a particular decision in anticipation of getting questioned about it afterwards. So those are kind of the two buckets that I would put things in, right? One is what's the appropriate structure? How can you teach people um, to create really good, like how do you create really good decision systems that are going to empower people to make better decisions? But then also, how do you actually give them the right mental models for them to understand, like, hey, this is okay to go fast. I want you to slow down here. so that people don't have that. First of all, they know that they don't need to kick something up the chain, but also so that they don't have a defensive reaction, defensive toward a future grilling around the decision that they might have made because they're applying the appropriate mental models for speed.
On the first point about structure, it reminds me of the Amazon leadership principles and how Jeff basically created them to showcase what is good behavior, but also good decision making. And outside of the leadership principles, I think it's also Amazon's narrative writing culture that helped instill that. But are there other structures you've seen companies, teams, or individuals employ that proved effective?
Well, I can tell you that the structures that I put in, and it's a mix. So first of all, let me just say something about Amazon's culture. If you have thousands and thousands and thousands of employees like Amazon does, I can understand why they block out the first 10 or 15 minutes of a meeting for people to actually read the material. I personally hate that. I'm all for writing. I'm a big writing culture person. I agree on that principle that you should have a writing culture. I just think people should read it before you come in the room. That's all. Like, I get like from a practical standpoint, maybe that's why they did that. But
Yeah.
with the companies that I work with, I don't allow that. Like do the work beforehand, or sorry, like don't talk to me. Um, okay, so let me give you an example of sort of kind of soup to nuts. So I'm going to talk first about um, how do you think about debiasing the decision by making your model of like how you actually make that decision, like what are the signals that you're trying to detect explicit, and then second, how do you employ some mental time travel and pre-commitment to create better behavior. So I'm going to do it twofold. So a lot of the problem that we have as decision makers is that we're making a decision, but most of what we're doing is implicit. And let me explain what I mean by that. You're exploring different options. Each of those options have some set of outcomes that are associated with them. Each of those outcomes has some probability of occurring. What you're trying to do is forecast for any option what the different outcomes are that might be associated and the probabilities associated with them. That is what there is literally no decision that you've ever made where that is not occurring somewhere. It's occurring under the hood. It has to be. Otherwise, you can't like choose a route to work. You can't choose what job you want to take. You can't even choose what you're going to order off a menu because that's what you're doing when you're deciding between chicken and fish. It's all the same. So in order to, first of all, be better at forecasting that, we're trying to figure out what are the signals that I'm supposed to be looking for that will tell me what the set of outcomes are and the probabilities with which they might occur. So we want to then make that, and that's going to create your model. These are the signals that I think are important for being able to make these forecasts given different options that I have. So that's generally occurring kind of like in the background. So what you'll hear, for example, in the venture world that I work in a lot is, and I've actually had VCs say this to my face, so how do you figure out who you're going to invest in? And they'll say, I know a good founder when I see one. I'm not kidding. That's a
Yeah.
quote.
Yep.
And I'm like, what? What does that mean? Because what they're saying is that there's some set of signals that tell me that I can detect as a human being that tell me that this person is going to be on average better than other founders and be more likely to have a company that is going to be a fund returner. Right. Um, so so it's interesting because when I ask them, hey, wouldn't you want to make that explicit? Most people will say no, and we can get into why that is. I think that's actually a very interesting problem. But I
Yeah.
have come across some people who said yes, and I actually work with a few of them. And so this is what we did there. We said, okay, I'm going to write to each of the partners individually. And I'm going to say, look, when you're looking at an investment, tell me what are the things that you're thinking about? What are the signals that you're trying to detect? What are the main categories that you're judging? What are the signals that you're looking for that tell you that that category is good or bad? So we then create a rubric out of that that's like founder, market, team, product, just broadly. And we're trying to figure out what is the strength of those things. And then there are what are called mediating judgments, which are those signals that would tell you it's a good or bad market. So things like competitive landscape would be a signal.
Mm,
Commerciality might be a signal, as an example. Um, so within market, we have between 4 and 7 signals that you're gonna rate. Within founder, we do the same thing, so on and so forth. We really care about those 4 broad categories, but notice that now, if you're new into this firm, when you go to fill that rubric out the first time, not only do you know that you should be thinking about the market and the founder and so on and so forth, but because of what are called these mediating judgments, you know what our definition of a good founder is.
mm,
So it's not just like, hey, I think it's good or bad. We actually quantify those things. They have to rate them on a scale of 1 to 7. So we're actually quantifying the qualitative opinions. Um, and then we have them make some forecasts, things like if they're investing at Series A, say, what's the probability this company will fund at Series B?
mm,
And that's a necessary but not sufficient uh, benchmark that you have to hit, and that will get you to, in other words, you can't have a fund returner without actually funding at the next round, right? So that it's necessary but not sufficient for the outcome that you're actually looking for. But we're defining what those necessary but not sufficient things are and actually making them put a probability on that. Um, so what is this doing for you as a decision maker? It's doing a few things for you as a decision maker. The first and the most important is that you're making explicit what your model is. And when you do
mm,
that, it reduces the sort of narrativizing that can occur, right? So a lot of times what happens is when we approach a decision, we kind of want a particular result, and we will sort of overplay some things and downplay other things that will kind of get us to the narrative we want, as opposed to going with the information first to get us to the conclusion. We generally work in the opposite direction, which is part of confirmation bias. And so this is making it so that you have to actually state very explicitly what your opinion is. It disciplines you to the model, right? And because they know that we're going to go look at that data later,
mm.
it puts them into a place of much higher accuracy, and then it improves the quality of the judgment. So that act alone is really going to improve the quality of the judgment. Now notice, I don't need to be there for that. Once we've created that rubric, I don't need to be there. I've now empowered them to make great decisions. That's thing number one. Thing number two is the 6 partners are all filling that rubric out independently.
Mm.
This is really important to empower great decision making, because they're all really smart, but they have different points of view. And the reason why we have a team is we believe that they each bring something interesting to the table, and we want different perspectives and more of a 360 around the decision. And because we're allowing no crosstalk, it allows us to get those opinions independently. So the founder comes in and pitches, they're silent after the pitch. They question the founder, normal stuff, right?
Yep.
They're silent after the pitch, and then they go to an online form, and they all fill it out. So that's the quantifying. But then we also get qualitative judgments, because for any of the broader judgments, those big ones, we also have them give us 3 to 5 sentences as to
Mm.
the why. So now we have all this data. So that makes the decision better in the moment, but it also makes the decision better in the long run, because as those decisions start to unfold and we start to see how those companies are doing, we can now tie it back to your signal detection at the time. In
Mm.
other words, higher scores should mean on average that the companies end up doing better, and lower scores on average, the companies are doing worse. And then we can go back and start to refine the rubric in a data-driven way, right? We can say,
On
oh,
the
signal that's totally noisy, let's cut it out.
to me, this is super fascinating because the whole founder fit is super ambiguous and is often cited as instinctual. On the founder signal checklist, are there peculiar signals that you've come up with these venture partners?
Yes, but I can't say what they are.
Uh,
But there are. But this is the important point of
Mm,
it. I'll give you an example. I can't say exactly what they were,
okay.
but I'll give you an example. I never come into a situation saying, you don't know your stuff. So when you tell me you know a good founder when you see one, I'm like, sure, Jason. Why should I not believe you? You're a successful
Mm,
venture capitalist, right? But then I say to you, define it. That's all I'm
mhm,
asking you to do, right? Like, I'm not telling you anything. I'm telling you define it. saying whatever your implicit model is, I have no doubt, but you have to actually be able to state it out loud, right? I
Mm.
mean, it's like a very simple act that people seem to be unwilling to do. So now you stated it out loud. Okay, so you're saying these signals are really important.
Yep.
Now, Alex, I'm having him do that independently. He may think that other signals are super important. I can look and say, well, what's overlapping? That's definitely going to go on. And then we're going to negotiate, and maybe uh, Alex his things go on there and your things go on there independently, right? Like so you guys get reflected into the thing. So I'm not going to tell you what the signals were, but this actually happened. And this is the beauty of this type of idea. So with one of the partnerships I work with, there were two managing partners. One of them, for one founder signal, was pounding the table. Like literally, this is the most important thing, and was absolutely insistent. Great. It ended up on, so partner A's thing ended up on the rubric. Partner B was pounding the table. No, this is the most important thing. Great. That also ended up on the rubric. So we've got both of those things ended up on the rubric. 4 years later, we had enough data to say, let's see how good those are as signals. Managing partner A, not only was the signal great for the managing partner, they were very good at detecting that signal, but every other partner was great at that signal. That signal was highly predictive
Mm.
of how that company was actually going to unfold. Managing partner B, none of the other partners had any predictive power for that signal. But here was the amazing thing. Neither did the managing partner who was pounding the table.
Mm.
It just wasn't a good signal. Now, so that's not to say that it might be a signal, like objectively speaking, that might be a signal, but it's clearly not one that these people can detect.
Mm.
So I don't
Yeah.
know whether I can't answer for you whether it's a terrible signal or it's just a great signal that they can't judge very well. I don't know. But it doesn't matter because it's going to come off the rubric. Now, this is what the beauty of making it explicit is that we know that whenever we're making judgments, we have all sorts of bias. There's lots of noise. We don't exactly know how we're weighting things. Like we're going to weight them differently depending on the time of day, our mood. Are we hungry? Are we in a bad mood? Did we just have a company that went through the roof and now we're sort of pattern matching to that? Did we just have a company that failed and we're pattern matching to that, which of course is ignoring the luck,
Mm.
right? There's all sorts of things that can be going on. So now we're just making all of that explicit, which is helping reduce that noise. But then as we get the data, we can actually go back and say, is this a good signal or not? Like I was willing to say that your implicit model was correct, but now let's go back and check it. And if we never do that, we never spot the error. So this managing partner who found out that the thing that they thought was number one
Mm.
found out, wait a minute, that's not right. These other things, and by the way, they were very good at judging all the other things under founder, except that one thing. They now get to correct that error. And if you don't make it explicit, you can never, ever correct the error. You just can't.
Mm.
So this becomes so important in so many ways because it's gotten huge short-term benefit in terms of the debiasing and making sure that you're weighting things appropriately and that you're not as swayed by like what you just saw or whatever, right? So it's like disciplining all of that. The knowing that there's going to be some accountability to your judgments is also helping. But then when you actually start to get the data, then it becomes even the most helpful because I can go back and say these things are good, these things are bad. I can actually start to apply data-driven weights to the
Mm.
different categories or the different judgments that create a better version of the composite score. I mean, there's so much stuff that you can do after that point, but you don't necessarily need to do all of that. If you just do the first thing, you're already so much of the distance there.
This model makes so much sense, and it reminds me a lot of Amazon's interview and hiring process with the bar raiser, etc., with the detailed rubric. I'm very curious. Are there companies, venture firms, etc., where they don't get this model, and for some reason they turn it down? Because to me, it's a
Almost all
no-brainer.
of them.
Why?
Yeah. So, okay. So I'll tell you a funny story. I was at a dinner a little bit ago where I was having this conversation and someone raised their hand and was just like, "You're wrong."
Great
Uh,
start.
and their argument, well, it was a while into the dinner, but their argument was that you can't catch outliers if you make these things explicit, which is weird, right? It's like if you have some model of a founder that allows you to capture the founder of Uber as well as the founder of Flexport, right? Like these are two very different companies, right? Like, or um,
Mm,
whatever, right? Like if you can spot like those two things that are really, really, really different from each other, um, well, gosh, so just make it explicit. It's not going to stop you from catching a new one because I think we can all agree that if you believe that that's not accidental, if you believe it's not accidental, then there's some underlying concept that you're seeing that
mm,
allows you to connect, even though the surface similarities don't seem to be there, you can see some quality of the founder underneath it. And don't you want to make that explicit? And by the way, pass that on to the next generation of people who are going to be investing, right? Like for
yeah.
you. But people aren't willing to do that. So the question is, why do most people reject it? Well, first of all, let me just say it's good for all of you that most people reject it because what it means is that there's a huge competitive advantage to be just literally like, oh, look, someone left a bunch of money on the ground. I'm just gonna pick that up, right? Um, I think that there's a lot of biases that come into play, and I would put them all under the category of I want to be magic. In other words, I want the things that I'm good at to be unique to me and to be something that differentiates me, that
Mm,
gives me a sense of self-worth and a positive self-narrative as it relates to in comparison to other people. Because a lot of where we get our, when we think about identity, we're getting it both from belongingness, right? Like belonging to a tribe or a certain group, but also this idea of distinctiveness. And distinctiveness, in a lot of ways, drives uh, our decision making much more than belongingness does. I think that you can see that in our politics, right? It's how am I distinct from the other tribe, not necessarily how do I align in beliefs with the tribe that I'm in. And I think that people have this misunderstanding that if I'm able to take whatever your implicit model is, whatever that gut is that you're using to make those decisions and make it explicit, that somehow that takes it away from you. But it doesn't. It just, it's still you. I mean, as I said, I come in and I say, tell me what you think about when you do it. And that's how we create the rubric. Um, but people somehow think now it's outside of me and it's not as magical anymore. And I think also people, I think there's also there's risk that you're exposing yourself to. So like, let's imagine, for example, that you were very early into Uber.
mm.
Um, do you really want to find out that that was an accident?
Only when it goes IPO, then you can say, oh yeah, it was sheer luck.
Yeah, right. But you're not really, but you don't mean it. You're saying
Yeah,
that to be false humility.
exactly.
So if you actually make that model explicit, then people can then critique it, right?
Mm,
Like everything, we have a record at the my clients have a record of every decision that they've made since we started this. We can go back and examine them. Like that there's a lot of risk to that if you think about it from not in a long-term sense. In a long-term sense, you're actually de-risking.
mhm.
But in a short-term sense, there's a lot of risk in terms of your identity and how you feel about yourself because people can go, whoa, wait, that's not right. Or you can be that managing partner who is pounding the table about something. And then we go and look at the data and we're like, dude, like I know you really believe this, but that's actually not a signal at all. And how, like that's a short-term, there's some short-term pain associated with that. So, I mean, like, let's imagine that you invested in Uber because your college roommate told you about a friend of theirs who was starting a company, full stop. Right? Imagine if you made that explicit. People would be like, what? Like, I'm not following your investment advice. That was total serendipity. Now, obviously, it's usually much more complex than that, but nobody really wants to know that, I think.
Mm.
So there's this general problem in cognitive psychology. It's called temporal discounting. Um, you can translate into something called present bias, which you can go look at, which is that we tend to trade off our future self for our present self.
Mm.
And so the pain of that kind of exposure or finding out we're not magic, that the thing, my model could be passed on to other people and it's not particular to me. I think it's too much for whatever the long-term gain you might be getting. And even if you do it right, like even if you make these models explicit, you could still be a much better decision maker than somebody else, right? In terms of detecting the signals that we've all agreed are very good signals, right? Like there's still this whole feel and art and that kind of stuff that's in there because two people could look at the exact same output of that rubric and one could say, I'm going to invest, and one could say, I'm not, right? Like, which we allow,
Mm.
right? So everybody fills the rubric out. There's a conversation that's driven around it. And then people ultimately say yes or no in private. And some people say yes, and some people say no, looking at the exact same data. That's great. That's why you have a team. But people don't want to do it. They just want to be magic all around.
Alex has a good follow-up. Alex, before you do that, I just have to say, because it reminded me of it, the famous phrase, ego is the enemy. What
Yeah.
you just described is actually a great model to combat that, specifically
Yes.
for senior executives, where,
Yeah.
a lot of them tend to be egotistical.
And let me say something that this is what has happened, and this happens in the cultures that I work in, is that they still get to have their ego. It just stops being the enemy because the ego, remember, we think about
Mm.
that distinctiveness piece. The ego comes from, hey, all you dum-dums over there aren't doing this thing that we're willing
Mm.
to do. Like,
Yes.
there's this really simple thing you could be doing to clean up your decision making. You're all not willing to do it because you don't want to feel bad for a second, but we're willing to do it. So notice that they get to grab that back, right? They get to grab that feeling of being superior
Mm.
to another tribe, which I think, by the way, is a natural human instinct. So if you want to go spend a bunch of time in Tibet and try to get over that natural human instinct, have at it, right? But I think most people don't have the time to go do that or the desire. So then the question is, how do you take something that naturally might end up being the enemy and actually kind of like remake it to get you to a place where you're going to do well, where it's not going to hurt you in the same way?
Love it. Alex, go
Mhm.
for it.
Yeah, so you didn't say it, but I heard you describing expected value earlier. Can you
Yes.
tell a little bit more about what expected value is, and in particular, um, how you use that, even if you don't have all the data?
Okay, I'm going to do that because you asked me, because I usually leave math out of these talks, but I'm going to do it. Okay, so every decision that you ever make is an expected value decision. Period, full stop. There's every decision is an expected value decision. So let me explain in the simplest terms what expected value is. It's a weighted average, um, uh, weighted by it's payoffs times probability. So that's where the weighting comes in. Average of um, possible outcomes. So uh, usually it's explained using like money. So if you have a two-sided coin, heads and tails, uh, that's 50-50. Um, there's a couple of ways that you could think about expected value. One is if you weren't betting on it, and you know that it's weighted 50-50 in the long run, you would expect there to be 50% heads and 50% tails. So expected value there would just be if I flip the coin 10,000 times, the expected value is 5,000 heads and 5,000 tails. Okay, so that's a very simple way to think about it. Now, notice on one flip, you can't get half tails ever. So this is the thing about expected value is it's a abstract concept, right? So it's an abstraction. But so on one flip, you can't get half tails, but out 10,000 flips, I can tell you what the expected number of tails is. Now we can take that a step further, which becomes more important for decision making, which is like, should I take a bet? So let's imagine, Jason, that for some reason, maybe because I like you, I was willing to offer you $2 for every $1 you were risking on calling a coin flip. And I told you, okay, I'm going to flip the coin, and if it lands heads, I'll give you $2. If it lands tails, you give me $1, and you're trying to figure out, well, should I take that bet? And then we can do an expected value calculation, right? So we know that it's going to land heads 50% of the time. So 50% of the time, you're going to get $2. You multiply those together. This is the weighting aspect. Multiply those two together. And so that's $1. The value of heads is $1 to you. And then tails is going to be 50%. And I'm going to get $1 from you on tails, right? So it's 50%, and 50% of $1 is 50 cents. So $1 is the value of heads to you, minus 50 cents is the value of tails to you. And so the total expected value of that bet for you would be 50 cents, meaning that for every dollar that you have at risk, that's what you could lose to me, you're making 50 cents. Now, again, what that means is that if a coin flips 10,000 times and you had to make a forecast of how much money you would make if you made that bet 10,000 times over, you would say $5,000. I'm going to risk $10,000. I'm going to make 5,000 on that 10,000. That's a pretty good bet. You should take that. But notice that on one flip, you're never getting 50 cents, right? You're either giving me $1 or you're getting $2. This is where people get a little bit hung up. The second place people get hung up is that they're like, well, what does that have to do with whether I want to get married to somebody or whether I want to take a job or something like that? And it's like, well, because this word value actually has to do with utility. And money is a good way to measure utility, right? Because if we're betting, obviously, that's the only outcome you care about. But you can measure like happiness, for example. So how would you measure happiness? You could put it on, for example, a scale of 1 to 10, or which you notice I do with my clients, right? Or 1 to 100. And then you can figure out the expected value of different, like how happy am I going to be given this outcome? How likely is the outcome going to be? You can get expected value that way. You can blend different values, right? So you can say, I want happiness and money and, time with my family. You can put a weight on each of those things. You can figure out an expected value for all of those things, multiply by the weights, right? And then you'll get an expected value. So that sounds complicated, but you can go read about it. It's pretty easy. So that's the first, that's the second place people get hung up. So the first is that this is a theoretical number, right? Like it's an abstraction. The second is, wait, but what if it's not money? And the third, and this is the most important thing, is, but what if I don't know what the payoffs are? And what if I don't know what the probabilities are? So notice that when we did the coin example, you knew that you were going to get $2 for every $1 that you were risking. And you also knew that the payoffs were 50-50, right? That it was going to land 50% of the time. Okay. So the question is then, what do you do if you don't know those things? And the most common thing that I hear, and actually Alex heard this many, many times over when he took my class, is people saying, but wait a minute, how can you do it if you don't know the answers to those things? It's, well, you're doing it anyway, so you might as well take your best shot. So the thing is that there's almost nothing that you know nothing about. And the better you are at narrowing down what the probability of certain things occurring are, or what the payoffs might be, the better you are at making an explicit guess of what the expected value is. And if you do that independently of, say, Alex, and independently of Anand, and independently of Diana, right? You all can look at what your expected value calculations are, look at what those educated guesses are, those forecasts, those estimates are that you're making, and then you can figure out, why are we differing, and start to get to a place of more accuracy. So I'll just give you the example of, like, how do you deal with this? Do you really not know? That's really what the question comes down to. And so I did this in class, but okay, so I have a dog. I assume you have never seen my dog. No.
I haven't.
Okay, great. Can you tell me, like, give me your best guess of what my dog weighs?
35 pounds.
Great. Okay, but you've never seen my dog, right?
Correct.
Okay, so that's interesting, right? Because you could say, wait a minute, I don't know, but you actually gave me a guess. That's good, right? What's the smallest amount that you think?
7.5.
Okay, and what's the biggest amount?
112.
112, great. Okay, so this is interesting because you could have said, I don't know.
Yeah.
But you didn't, right? I forced you, right? I
Yeah.
forced you to give me some answers. Great. So here's my question for you. Why didn't you guess that my dog was 500 pounds?
Because I've never seen a 500-pound dog.
That's right. So you know a lot about dogs. So in those situations where we have that instinct to say, I don't know, so I can't do this. The fact is, well, no, you do know, because you know that dogs don't weigh 500 pounds. And by the way, that's pretty amazing because cars can weigh like tons.
Mm.
Right? So like you actually got down to a pretty narrow range around what the dogs can weigh. My dog can weigh. The other thing that was really interesting is that the guess that you gave, which was 35 pounds, is much closer to 7.5 pounds, which was your lower bound,
Mm.
than it is to 112 pounds. So what you've also told me is dogs skew to the smaller side. That's actually a lot of information you gave me. So you're saying more dogs are smaller. There's more smaller dogs than bigger dogs.
Mm.
You told me that.
Yep.
And you told me it's not a puppy, so it can't really be super small,
Oh, good question. Yeah.
right? Because otherwise you could have guessed 2 pounds, right? But it's not a
Yep.
puppy.
Yep.
And it doesn't weigh 500 pounds, right? So like look at how much is in there. So by the way, my dog weighs 42 pounds. I know that because I was at the vet with him this morning. So you're pretty close. So, but here's the interesting thing, right? Is that the process of doing that makes your decision making more accurate. Because obviously it's going to be noisy, right? You've never seen my dog.
Yep.
Obviously, you're not going to get it right as if it's a 2 + 2 = 4 problem, or a should you take a 2-to-1 bet on a fair coin, right? Clearly, it's not like that type of math equation.
Mm.
But this stuff is all happening under the hood anyway. So instead of defaulting to, well, I can't possibly know, so I'm just going to stick my finger in the wind, and let my biases take over, make these guesses explicit. Because you will now define, this is what I know and this is what I don't know. And then when you look at what Alex's range is, his range might be different. And you can say, well, wait a minute, why did you guess 5 pounds and 120 pounds? You know, and Deanna's guess might be different. And Anand's guess might be different. And now what happens is that you can sort of go between, you're going to now get a much better range and a much better understanding of what you know, which is then going to allow you to make a better decision. So as an example, when I ask my clients to forecast what the probability is that a company funds at Series B, they obviously don't know.
Mm.
They're making a forecast based on the information that they have at the time with some rationale why they think it's more likely than average 2 or less likely than average 2 or a lot more likely. I mean, they actually quantify it, but so if they say they think it's 75%, it's going to fund it the next round, they give a rationale in the same way that you just gave a rationale for your guess.
Mhm.
I'll say,
Okay. Go ahead, Alex. Go ahead.
I was say we did a whole exercise of that in the class with a bunch of different things, like the length of the Nile River and stuff like that. And even being told explicitly, like, be as broad as you want, I don't think anyone got over maybe like 5 out of the 10 like that.
Yes.
Like it's much harder to do than it seems on the surface. So it takes
Oh yeah, I
practice.
believe that.
Yeah. It is tough to do, but the nice thing is that if you have multiple people doing it, you're more likely to catch the error, because even though each individual is overconfident, they're going to be overconfident in different directions. So if the only thing you did was have a bunch of people do it and take the lowest lower bound and the highest upper bound, I guarantee you people would get that right. If that's all you did. Right. But obviously you can do even more. Someone asked in the chat, doesn't this get you into an endless loop of questions? And my answer is, well, probably not, because at some point you just say, is the next piece of information that I get going to change my mind? And you'll be surprised how often the answer to that is no. But the other thing is that you're doing it anyway. That's all I can keep saying. It's happening under the hood. So make it explicit. How explicit you want to make it and how much process you want to put around it is going to depend on the type of decision that you're facing. Is it a decision that deserves that much questioning? But like I can tell you as an example with my venture clients, they go and they fill out a form. It takes about 15 or 20 minutes after the partner meeting is over. And then the discussion that they have around what they've discovered through those rubrics that they filled out takes another 20 to 45 minutes. And then they make a decision. These are huge decisions, multi-million-dollar decision. But we've gotten enough information. This actually stops you from the endless questioning and gets you to a place of being willing to make a decision, because you're applying this structure and it's getting you to kind of like, here are the questions that we need to ask ourselves, as opposed to constantly thinking of a new thing that we're supposed to ask.
Mm.
And we're not asking anybody to come to consensus. And this is a really important part of decision making, is that you may think the market is a 7, I may think it's a 4, and there's no expectation that we end up agreeing with each other, which stops the looping.
Mm-hmm.
It's that I just need to inform you, Jason, of why I believe what I do. And then you inform me of why you believe what you do. I can ask you questions about that to make sure that I fully understand and that I could actually argue your case. And in reverse, but I'm never trying to convince you that I'm right. And that also stops a lot of this kind of endless looping, right? Because we've now defined, here are the things that matter to this decision. We're going to make judgments about those things with some qualitative writing around that, right? Then we're going to have a discussion about the places where we disagree, but we're not going to make each other agree with it. We're not going to make each other
Mm-hmm.
agree. And then we're going to go make a decision, and the decision doesn't need to be unanimous.
Yeah, that's a great point about, you don't need to reach consensus or even agree to make a decision. And
I
because
hope
the
not.
worst thing is not to make a decision, right?
Well, the worst thing is to not make a decision, and consensus is horrible, right? So
Mm.
it's interesting, because the concern of the gentleman who said, well, I can't make it explicit because then I'll never catch outliers.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually, no, I can't make it consensus or I'll never catch an outlier. That's actually the right answer, right?
Yeah,
Is you don't want
good
it to be
reframe.
consensus. That's not to say that if everybody agrees that the person is great, that you shouldn't invest in them. Like, obviously, you should still invest in them, but you don't need to all agree. Sometimes everybody will agree, but there shouldn't be any requirement for that.
Mm.
So you can have, there's a variety of ways for you to resolve those differences. Uh, for a lot of decisions, a single decision maker is fine, where the team is informing the decision maker, and then the decision maker is using that information
Yeah.
to actually decide. That's fine. If you have like some kind of voting system, it could be like majority rules. It could be a
Mm.
weighted majority depending on seniority or expertise. There are ways to create some betting on your opinion. That's complicated. I don't want to go into that
Mm.
too much, but you can do it. But so, basically you just have to decide, like, is this a single decision maker? Is this a committee? Is it some subset of the group that's making the decisions? But you shouldn't go beyond majority.
Yeah, yeah. This conversation of expected value, it reminded me, in this age of AI, there's two interesting things happening. You're seeing upstart companies who are launching these new AI products,
I believe there's a
specific.
company called Upstart, as a matter of fact.
Oh yeah, probably upstart.ai, right? But they're specifically targeting incumbent big businesses. So that's a no-brainer, right? Expected
Yeah.
outcome could be big and the downside is small. The more fascinating piece to me is these companies with golden goose businesses. And they're literally facing the innovator's dilemma. Let's just take, Google is a great example. They
Right.
can be the leaders in AI, but they have the search business. How on earth do you make that decision where the third variable is, I can kill my good business right now?
So I think that, yeah, I mean, that's always a very big
Yeah.
problem. There's a variety of reasons why. Again, this is short-term versus long-term and planning
Mm.
for it. So uh, the fact is that, I mean, obviously in the long run, Google would own the business that kills their business, right? So it
Yes.
shouldn't actually be that much of a dilemma. The problem is that there's short-term transitional pain. I will
Mhm.
tell you that the only time that I've seen that work is when they create literally like a separate entity.
Okay. Yeah, I can see that.
So you have to be willing as a company to go say, I'm going to fund an innovation hub, right?
Mm.
You're going to be like a totally different thing. Your decision making is your own. Here's your budget. Don't worry about it.
Mm. Okay.
Because otherwise, I think the conflict becomes, it just becomes so great. I mean, what is
Yeah.
it? Is it Blockbuster that had a chance to buy Netflix?
Yeah, I believe
Why
so.
did they do it? Because it would have replaced their business.
Hmm.
which they no longer have,
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
right? So you have to find a way to sort of relieve that short-term conflict of interest, because in the long run, it's better for Google,
Yeah.
right?
My favorite question to combat short-termness is asking yourself, what would my successor do?
So mental time travel as in general, as a strategy, is incredibly good for combating bias. It has to do with a concept called distancing in
Mm,
psychology. So we can think about distancing as like Americans care more about Americans than people in Africa. That
mm,
actually makes no sense, except that we have all sorts of different ways in which people in Africa are more psychologically distanced from us. One thing
mm,
that creates psychological distance is actually geographical distance, uh, but also tribe creates distance, right? So we identify with this tribe, which has an American flag, which even though we might physically be closer to someone in Canada, we might identify more with someone who's in an American state that's physically farther away from us. So there's a couple of tricks you can use in distancing to help you to debias. One of them is how would I advise someone in this situation? So imagine that there was somebody like this and I was advising them what to do. What would I advise them to do? So that's
mm,
getting you to sort of like be an outsider to yourself. So that's one way to create distance. The other is what you just said, is to actually launch yourself into the future. And if you combine that with something called a pre-commitment contract, you get into this really good space. So, for example, when I'm asking people these types of questions, I'll say, okay, so imagine it's a year from now, or imagine it's 2 years from now. Uh, it turned out very badly. What do you think happened? Things turned out really well. What do you think happened? What were the early signals that was going to occur? What would the inputs be to a good outcome or a bad outcome? And then I get them, having done that, as you're thinking about what would my successor do, because that's the exact same question, right? What would my successor do? Then you actually create what's called a pre-commitment contract, a pre-commitment device, where you actually contract with yourself or other people to
mm,
actually follow through on those actions,
mm.
right? Because I can say, as I'm staring down, a cheeseburger, fries, and a milkshake, a week from now, am I going to be happy that I ate this?
Mm.
And I can come up with the answer no, and that's
Yeah.
going to reduce the likelihood that I eat it. But even better is if I say, I imagine that future me is never going to be happy that I ate something like that. So I'm actually just going to make a pre-commitment contract that I don't eat stuff like that.
Mm.
Right. And
Okay.
that's what's called a diet. So like so it's actually interesting. So if somebody says I'm keto, they're actually expressing a pre-commitment contract.
Mm.
These foods are things that I'm willing to eat, and these foods are things that I'm not. And that was developed by doing some mental time travel and imagining the goals that you had for your health in the future.
Yeah,
So you can use that same type of idea in decision making. It's very powerful.
I love that. I have a list of speed run questions, but before we get there,
Okay, let's
Alex,
do
any
it.
other
Okay.
Alex, any other follow-ups from you or questions?
Um, I don't know if it's going to be a speed one, but I know one of the big things that's hard, especially as you start deep diving into the different tools for decision making. How do you balance making that best decision versus a good enough decision? Because I don't think every decision requires the same rigor, and sometimes it can be hard to separate those.
Yeah, thank you. That's a softball, Alex. Thank you. I like that. Um, Okay, so it's always good to know what the goal is. Um, so basically, there's kind of two things that you want to think about in terms of thresholding, because that's what you're asking. What does it mean to be good enough? And that threshold for good enough is going to be different depending on the type of decision. So basically, you want to think about decisions that you're approaching through the lens of two things. One thing is impact, and by impact, I don't mean short-term impact, I mean long-term impact. So what you want to say is, if this goes poorly, how bad is it? It's generally where you want to focus. Um, I think about this as like the intern versus CFO problem. If I hire an intern and it goes badly, how bad is that for my bottom line?
Mm.
Not would be the answer. Uh, And then if I hire a CFO and this goes badly, how bad is it for my bottom line? Lots, right? So one is very high impact, one is very low impact, and then you can think of anything that's has impact in between. And what we know then is that the threshold for good enough for hiring an intern is going to be much lower than the threshold for good enough for hiring a CFO. And so you would create some kind of rubric. If you're hiring an intern, it's probably a pretty simple and quick checklist. They're not an axe murderer. They have the right type of training, whatever. Like it's gonna be a pretty easy
Baseline stuff.
right? And you may have like a bunch of people that satisfy that, like in whatever, and then just flip a coin among them. Whereas with the CFO, you're going to create a much more detailed rubric. You're going to do more structured interviewing, think more like Amazon. I hope you don't do that for interns, but for CFOs, you definitely should do that. And the threshold for getting to good enough ought to be higher. Then the second thing that you want to think about, the big category that you want to think about is reversibility. So since you seem to be a Jeff Bezos fan, I'm now going to knock him. I already knocked him once for the why are you making people read in a meeting? What a waste of time. Yes. And it's reversibility, one-way door, two-way door. But please don't ever use that again, because one-way door and two-way door is binary. And it is not, reversibility is not binary. The thing that you should ask yourself is, how much does this cost to reverse? Because death is not reversible. And I think having a child is not reversible, but everything else is reversible. Literally, everything else is reversible. The question is just at what cost. So I hate that one-way door versus two-way door because it puts it into one bucket or another, which doesn't really make any sense. Because it's all how much does it cost to reverse. So you can go back and say, how much does it cost for me to reverse the decision to hire an intern? Almost nothing. How much does it cost for me to reverse the decision to hire a CFO? Quite a lot. Right. So now we can see in the CFO and intern situation, those two things converge to tell you that the threshold for good enough is going to be much, much higher for a CFO than an intern. How do you know when you've gotten to good enough? Well, basically, you just ask yourself for any option under consideration. If this were my only option, would I be okay with it, or would I continue to go looking? And as soon as you get to, yes, this option is fine, then you're done. And you may actually have more than one thing that satisfy the only option test. So for example, with an intern, which is low impact, high reversibility, I might end up with 20 interns that if this were the only intern I could hire, I'd be totally fine with it. And I literally don't want you to try to distinguish among them. It's a waste of your decision-making time. Put their names in a hat and pull one out. If with a CFO, you might only end up with two, right? But that's fine. Once you get those two, don't try to do anything to distinguish them from each other, because you can't, because you're making the decision under uncertainty. Just flip a coin, right? If you've only got one, then that question becomes, would I think this was fine, or would I prefer to keep my search going? And if you prefer to keep your search going, you don't hire the person.
I was going to say, funny story. My friend is the founder of a Series C company, and a very famous VC told him, hey, if you come across two investors and they're exactly the same and you can't decide, use the airport test. Who would you, want to sit on an airplane with? And he said, oh, that's really smart, but it's not you, so I'm going with the other person.
Oh, I love that. That's hilarious.
Yeah, but anyways, he took the advice.
That's hilarious.
Your point about on the previous topic about the diet, I just had to say, it reminded me of Clayton Christensen's phrase that it's easier to be 100% integrity than 98%.
Yes.
Yeah, it really hit.
Right. And with the diet, with something like keto, so pre-commitment contracts are often more complex than that. I give you a simple version. I'm a vegan. That's a version of it. But that particular type of pre-commitment contract is what's called a category decision. So a category decision just eliminates, it just eliminates whole categories of things. So this is the category within which I'm willing to operate, and this is the category that I'm not. It's a particularly helpful, category decisions are a particularly helpful concept for investors who tend to think they know more about instruments that they aren't actually specialists in. So they get a little halo effect going on. So if you're a bond trader You shouldn't start spouting off about equities or maybe even trading them except in as much as you might use them a hedge against your bonds, right? Um, so there's also, like, for example, if I trade, like options, and I specialize in mortgage options or something, right? I shouldn't like veer out of that and think I'm going to become a value investor and necessarily be going and trading a different desk, right? Like I would need to learn that. So there's all sorts of ways in which that applies to investing in particular, where these category decisions become incredibly helpful. But they're the most they're kind of the most robust version of a pre-commitment contract.
That makes sense. Okay. I'm gonna hit the speed run. Alex, if you
Okay.
have anything, just chime in. Unmute yourself. That would be the signal I see. Okay, so Annie, if you could get all your book readers and followers to adopt one habit, what would you want them to adopt?
There's so many. Okay. I'm gonna say, stop telling people what you think when you're trying to get their opinion. Get their opinion before you tell them what you think.
Oh, that's a good one. I like that.
I think
Okay.
that's the best one, but
Oh, that's good. That's a really good one. Okay,
thank
because
you.
I am at fault at doing the opposite.
People
Okay,
do it
oh,
all the
that's a good.
time. They're like,
Yeah.
listen, I think this strategy is the one I prefer of the three we're considering, but tell me why I'm wrong. Okay.
Oh, okay, that's a good one. Is there a habit you've changed recently?
That I've changed recently.
Yeah.
Like a decision-making habit or an actual habit.
I'll leave it up to you.
Yeah. Um, I don't know. I'm really old, so but I've done a lot of habit change throughout my life, both around how I eat, how I exercise, even how I talk to my children. Um, uh, the thinking probabilistic stuff, that's a habit that's been around for a really long time. Um, uh, Here's something that I changed actually. I had to change. So I work a lot, and my husband finally said to me, I'd really like it if you stopped working after 6. So I
Oh, I
did.
like that.
Yeah, so
Nice.
I don't work after 6. I occasionally do, like if I'm teaching a class, often I'll be after 6, but I mostly, like, if I don't have something extra special, I don't work after 6. So I did that because I felt that balancing my happiness with my husband, with my fulfillment from my work was important, and I should fulfill
Okay.
that.
I love that. I like it. Uh, Uncertainty. People have a hard time dealing with it. How has your relationship with uncertainty evolved over the years?
Interestingly enough, not very much. I mean, I think that um poker, the main evolution was in poker that you just have to really get comfortable with uncertainty. So uh that scene in Rounders, I don't know if people have seen that movie where Matt Damon's like, you have a Jack 10 of spades and you have an ace. Like, that's not how that works. I can count a few times in my life where I knew exactly what the person had just because the betting pattern and the cards on the table made it very obvious that they could only have that hand. But that's like almost never. Mostly what you're doing is being okay with making these decisions when you don't exactly know what the other person has. You're trying to come up with a range of what they could have, and then you're trying to figure out what they're going to do in response to that, and then trying to come up with the best play that kind of maximizes your expected value across all the things they could be holding and what you expect them to do. And then you also have to deal with the fact that you don't have control over the next card that's going to come. So that real understanding that like uncertainty is our state of being, so you just have to be okay with it. And I don't get very anxious in states of uncertainty. I really just kind of accept them, and I think kind of thrive in those environments. But I had 18 years of playing poker to train me to do that.
If you had to put a probability on the Eagles repeating in the Super Bowl this year, what would you put it on?
Wait, they didn't win 2 years ago. They only won a year
No,
ago. So repeating. I thought you said
repeating, yeah.
like, wait, did I miss something? Okay, well, the way that you would do that is what's the probability that they win enough to get to win the division? And so you have to take into account, I would go and look up the base rate because obviously they could have key injuries, right? So I'd want to understand like how often does a Super Bowl winner get to the playoffs the next year? So that's the first thing I need to understand. I would just go look up a base rate for that. I wouldn't try to pretend to know anything else. And then after that, I would look up the probability for winning each of the playoffs games. And then the probability for winning the Super Bowl. So I would have to multiply that base rate, the base rate for getting to the playoffs, and then the base rate for the Super Bowl winner winning each of the playoff games that they had to play. So I'd multiply all those together as a conditional probability times the probability they win the Super Bowl. So it would be pretty low because I would have to think like the Super Bowl itself. I mean, I would imagine it's going to be somewhere around 50-50 for the Super Bowl.
Probably, yeah, just for the Super Bowl. Yeah.
Just for the Super Bowl. For the other ones, I mean, it's gonna be skewed in the first round of the playoffs. I would assume they would be favorites, but so even there, you're already going to cut any probability that you've already gotten in half, and you're already going to be pretty low because it's a conditional probability. So, I don't know
think that's a fun one because
if I had to guess off the top of my head, given all the conditionals that are in there, I mean, I'm guessing it would be like 20%. No, less than that, probably 15. It's got to be low.
that even feels high. Just
Yeah, that
like you
feels
said, just
high.
thinking
Like
of
there's too
everything
many
they can
conditional
win.
probabilities in there.
Yeah.
10.
You heard it here first, 15% chance.
Mm-mm. No, literally, I'm saying I don't know. I think you're right. I think 15 is high. Actually, I could just go look and say, what's the probability of a repeat, right? I mean, it's probably 1% or something. I could just go be even more simple and just go look up the base rate for the number of repeats there's been ever.
There you go. That's the speed.
That's a speed way to do it.
Yeah.
See, everything's an expected value. I just proved it.
Annie, do you have time for 2 very quick questions?
Yes.
Okay. Your very popular Maven course on decision making or making better decisions. What's something that students have a really hard time understanding or putting into practice?
Expected value.
Okay.
Yeah, it's definitely number one. I think it's why Alex asked about it. This idea that you don't know the actual probabilities, or you don't know what the actual payoffs are, or you don't actually even know exactly what the range of outcomes are. I think it's just really hard for people to live in that uncertainty. That's why I saying like I'm so comfortable with it. Like Alice asked me the probability of repeating, and I just started spouting off, well, this is how I would figure it out. And then even at the end of it, I was like, I guess I could just go look up how many times it's happened. Divided by the number of or the number of opportunities for it to happen, divided by the number of times it's actually happened.
Yep.
Right. So the number of opportunities would obviously just be every Super Bowl after the first one, because you could repeat, and then the number of times you've actually repeated, and then just divide that, and I would be able to get the probability. So, but you notice that I'm totally willing there to just be like, that's the best guess that I could give you. But people ask over and over again, but what if I don't know? What if I don't know the answer? And I have to say over and over and over again in the class, you're never going to be perfect. This is never going to get you to the objective truth. It's going to get you better. And even a little bit better is going to accrue over time into massive decision-making gains.
Yep.
So I would say that that's the biggest one. Yeah.
I'll quickly add, and one of the things that we had talked about before was there's sometimes hidden information that we don't see on the surface, but if we think to find it, it gives us a lot more information and gets us a much better expected value calculation.
Right. And in order to do that, you have to make explicit what you're doing, because that's part of why the rationales really matter. Because when you give a rating and you go to write a rationale for that rate, for that judgment that you've given, that's when you actually figure out, wait a minute, this doesn't make a lot of sense. Maybe I need to go find something else. So it's that the way that those actually work together is to help expose the stuff that you don't know, and then getting people's independent opinions independently is also doing that as well. So some information that you might not have access to, somebody else might, and through doing this process this way, you're more likely to find that out. Someone just Googled it.
13.3%.
Interesting.
Not bad.
Interesting. Not bad. Not bad at all.
Not bad. See, it's like 35 pounds for my dog.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah,
But
it's, you know,
notice, but
it's
the thing is that because you asked me to give my guess and I had to go through the process explicitly, that's where, notice I have to say, wait, okay, because then you actually have to think about it. They have to win the division. Then they have to win the first round. I assume they won't be wild card in that case, or they have to be a wild card. So I would have to take both of those into account. So there might be an extra playoff game in there. And then I've got to multiply that by XXXX, right? And then what's the odds of them actually winning the Super Bowl, which I know can't be really, that has to be 50-50,
yeah.
given that it's an unknown team, right? If I knew the teams, it would be different, but I don't because it's a year from now. So I have to put that at 50-50. So I know that even after I finish with that conditional probability, I'm going to have to cut it in half. Right. But I can only do that because I made my thinking explicit. That's why making your thinking explicit is so important.
Yeah, that makes sense. This might be a big question, but maybe let's see if we can nail it in a sentence or two.
Okay.
Annie, how do you discern between quitting too soon and quitting at the right time?
There's nothing that you've ever quit too soon, so that's an easy one. I mean,
Oh,
if you're under 25,
yeah.
right? Like maybe, right? Like a kid is going to quit something too soon. But
Mhm.
like you as an adult who's in this group, you haven't quit anything as an adult too soon. And the reason
Mm,
is that the biases are really stacked against us for quitting, because we want to be able to say like I tried everything because it has to do with our identity. I
yeah.
tried everything. So I would ask you this. So I'm sure that you've had to let people go. I'm sure that you've had to break up with people, quit a job, so on and so forth, right? So I'm sure you've had lots of things that you walked away from. How many of them, looking back, did you say, ugh, I really kind of waited too long?
None.
You think you did it all on time?
No, I think I could have done it faster.
Yeah. So I
Yeah.
really think I waited too long,
Yeah. Oh, yeah,
right?
yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah,
right? Okay, right. So are you always saying, man, I did that too soon?
yeah. Mm,
No, you're not even saying when you look in retrospect, man, I did that at exactly the right time.
yeah.
You always look back and you say, oh, I took that, I waited too long. I should have done that sooner. You always think that. And the reason is that the amount of information that we want to accumulate in order to be willing to quit something is much greater than the amount of information that we actually need
Mhm.
because we want to be certain, right? We want to be able to say to someone, I tried everything. I didn't have a choice. But I didn't have a choice should be the clue that that's a bad thing to do because you want to make choices when you still have them.
Yep.
So, yeah. So the answer is I can always tell because I've never quit anything soon enough, ever.
I love it.
Me
That's a great
either.
call to
I haven't
action.
either.
Um, I know we're way over time. What is for all the viewers and future viewers, what's the best way for them to follow you to consume your information or material?
Well, so you can follow me on Substack, which I just made
Yeah.
free. There's no subscription anymore. And the reason is that I'm working on a book, and so I haven't really had a lot of time to post on there. Um, you can follow me on social media, but it's not really me, so I wouldn't really suggest it. Um, uh, so I would say the best thing is go to the Alliance for Decision Education. I host a podcast over there. I think it's a great podcast. We have all sorts of decision-making experts on that. Season 5, I think, just came out, or 6, and I'm currently recording the next season. I just started. And so that's super fun. There's lots of podcasts you can find me on. My media is over on annieduke.com. Um, and then my Maven course, the next
Mm.
cohort is launching the last week of April, I think. Um, I Alex took it. That's why I'm here. I think it's a great class. And
Seconded. I,
thank you.
I would highly recommend it. Even if you're familiar with Annie's work, like being able to really deep dive into the different examples and stuff was super helpful. So if anyone's interested in up leveling their decision making, I would highly recommend it.
Awesome. So yeah, so go check out the class on Maven. I've got a cohort that's launching right now, and then the next one will be in the fall.
Awesome. Well, Annie, I thought this conversation was super thoughtful and also thought-provoking. And a couple years in the future, I wouldn't be surprised if we're looking back and you have a Moneyball moment with what you're doing in the venture space, because I think it'll have that big of an impact. So thank you.
Wow. Well, I hope so. Well, thank you. I'm going to go run and work out now because that's one of my pre-commitment contracts.
Awesome. Have a great workout. Thanks, Alex.
All right.
Thanks, Annie. Bye.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Andy. Thanks, Jason.